EDO.
There's a man in a parking lot. He's been standing there for nearly 40 minutes. He's positioned near a row of public telephones mounted to the wall beneath Tel Aviv City Hall, just steps from where the Prime Minister's motorcade will pull in when the rally ends. The area is designated a restricted security zone. No unauthorized personnel are supposed to be anywhere near it. The Prime Minister of Israel is 50 yards away, on a stage, in front of 100,000 people. And this young man, 25 years old, compact, dark-haired, wearing a white dress shirt, has been loitering in the one spot on earth he is most certainly not supposed to be. And not a single security officer has asked him a single question. His name is Yigal Amir. He has a Beretta 84 semi-automatic pistol tucked into his waistband. And he's been here before. Twice in the previous months, he had positioned himself near Rabin at public events. And twice, he had lost his nerve or lost his angle and walked away. But tonight, he's not going to walk away. Above him on the stage, the Prime Minister is singing. The song is called Shir LaShalom, the song for peace. Rabin is singing it badly but joyfully, reading the words from a sheet of paper, and the 100,000 people in the square are singing it with him. When the song ends, he folds the paper, puts it in his breast pocket, shakes a few hands, and says his goodbyes. He begins the walk down the stairs toward the motorcade. Yigal Amir steps out of the shadows. What happens next is both utterly documented and, in certain specific and stubborn details, still disputed by forensic experts, eyewitnesses, and investigators who have spent decades trying to reconcile what the physical evidence shows with what the official record claims. By the end of this episode, you'll understand exactly what is established, what is contested, and why, 30 years later, the questions haven't gone away. Welcome back to the Ides of April. This is The Last Handshake, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, Episode 2, The Parking Lot. If you listened to the first episode and you're not following the podcast yet, please do it now, wherever you listen. You can also follow us on social media and check out the videos on YouTube. It takes 10 seconds, and it keeps this kind of storytelling alive. Chapter 4 of our story begins now. 9:30 p.m. The rally had exceeded every expectation the organizers had allowed themselves to hold. 100,000 people in the streets of Tel Aviv on a Saturday night, and not in protest, not in anger, but in something rarer and far more fragile. Hope. Or at least the public performance of it, which in politics sometimes amounts to the same thing. Rabin had addressed the crowd with his characteristic economy. He didn't speechify. His words and voice didn't soar. He said in the direct and slightly gruff manner that was entirely his own that he had been a soldier his whole life, and he believed that peace was now achievable, and that it was worth the risks it required. The crowd gave him an ovation that lasted several minutes. Shimon Peres, his foreign minister and longtime political rival turned reluctant partner, was at his side, visibly moved. And then came the song. Shir LaShalom had been written in 1969 by poet Yaakov Rotblit and composer Uriah Rosenblum, and it had accumulated over the decades that particular weight of a song that people sing at the moments when they most need to believe what they're singing. Rabin held the paper. He sang. He clearly wasn't a singer, and he didn't pretend to be, and the crowd didn't care. At 9:30 p.m., he descended the stairs from the stage and moved through the cordoned path toward his waiting Cadillac. His bodyguard, Yoram Rubin, was directly behind him. The path to the car was supposed to be cleared and secured. The parking area beneath City Hall was supposed to only contain authorized personnel. These are the conditions that were supposed to exist. And they didn't exist. Amir was standing approximately 3 feet behind Rabin when he fired the first shot. That's point-blank range, and went right into the Prime Minister's back. Rabin lurched forward and went down, and Amir fired a second shot, which struck bodyguard Yoram Rubin in the arm. Amir was tackled immediately by security personnel, and he didn't resist. He was calm. According to the officers who subdued him, he appeared almost relieved. When asked why he had done it, he said he acted on the orders of God and that he was satisfied. Rabin was lifted from the ground and placed in his limousine. His driver, Menachem Dapti, took a route to Ichilov Hospital that was, by multiple subsequent accounts, longer than the most direct available path. And this detail would later become a major point of contention. But Rabin arrived at Ichilov conscious and still able to speak. The hospital's initial public statement described his wounds as moderate. He was taken directly into emergency surgery. At 11:10 p.m., Yitzhak Rabin died on the operating table from blood loss and damage to his spinal column and internal organs. The folded page of Shir LaShalom in his breast pocket was soaked entirely through with blood. Eitan Haber, Rabin's chief of staff, walked out of the hospital and stood before the gathered press in public. He was holding the blood-soaked page. His voice broke, and he read the words of the song that Rabin had been singing just 40 minutes earlier. And then he said, "The government of Israel announces in shock and in deep grief the death of Prime Minister and Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was murdered tonight." Israel went silent, then it wept. Chapter 2. What the record shows. Yigal Amir confessed within minutes of his arrest. He was apprehended at the scene by multiple witnesses. He was tried, he was convicted by a panel of 3 judges, and sentenced to life in prison, plus 6 additional years for wounding Rabin's bodyguard. He has never recanted. He told the court that he had no regrets. The judges wrote in their verdict that his act was, quote, abominable sevenfold, because he not only expressed no remorse, but sought to demonstrate that he was at peace with himself over what he had done. He remains incarcerated today. The Israeli Knesset subsequently passed a law specifically prohibiting the pardon of anyone convicted of assassinating a prime minister, a law informally known as the Yigal Amir law. The Shamgar Commission, Israel's official inquiry into the assassination, chaired by former Supreme Court President Meir Shamgar, produced a thorough and, in many respects, damning report on the security failures that allowed the murder to occur. The commission found that the Shin Bet had, for years, systematically underestimated the threat posed by Jewish extremists, even as evidence accumulated that the incitement against Rabin had reached dangerous levels. It found that specific intelligence suggesting a potential assassination attempt by a Jewish militant had been received and not acted upon with appropriate urgency. It found that coordination between the Shin Bet and police on the night of November 4th had been deeply inadequate, and that Amir had been permitted to stand in a restricted security zone for an extraordinary length of time without being questioned or without being removed. Shin Bet director Carmi Gillen accepted personal responsibility for these failures and resigned. Now that's the official record. It is, in its essential conclusion, that Yamir Igal killed Yitzhak Rabin, supported by overwhelming and unambiguous evidence, eyewitnesses, confession, physical evidence, conviction. What the official record is less tidy about are the several specific forensic details that investigators, pathologists, and journalists have continued to raise in the decades since. The first concerns gunpowder. Police forensic reports established that gunpowder residue was found on Rabin's clothing and body at a concentration consistent with the shot fired at extremely close range. what forensic scientists call a contact shot or a near contact shot. The official account of the assassination, again, places Amir at approximately 1 meter, or around 3 feet, from Rabin when he fired. At 1 meter, the dispersion of gunpowder residue from a standard 9mm round wouldn't produce the concentration documented on Rabin's clothing. This discrepancy was noted in testimony before the Shamgar Commission, and it wasn't resolved. Official investigators suggested measurement uncertainty and the chaos of the scene as possible explanations. Forensic specialists who reviewed the evidence independently were not uniformly satisfied with those explanations. The second concerns the wound trajectory. The autopsy, conducted by Dr. Yehuda Hiss, documented 2 bullet entry wounds in Rabin's upper back, consistent with shots fired from behind by someone in Amir's position. The surgical team at Ichilov Hospital, however, produced operative notes describing a wound presentation that several of the attending surgeons characterized as including entry from a direction inconsistent with the autopsy findings. Both the pathologist and one of the surgeons maintained that they had personally removed a bullet from the body. 2 bullets, 1 body, 2 different doctors claiming to have extracted them. The chain of forensic custody around the physical evidence became a documented point of confusion that the official inquiry acknowledged, but again, didn't cleanly resolve. Now, none of this proves a conspiracy. What it does prove is that the physical evidence contains specific, documented inconsistencies that were never fully accounted for in the official record. And that's a different and a more precise claim, and it's the only claim that I'm trying to make here. Chapter 3, Unanswered. There's a detail from the night of November 4th that tends to get lost in the larger drama, but that once you know it, it's kind of difficult to set aside. Rabin's driver, Menachem Dapti, testified before the Shamgar Commission that before the shooting, he had announced over the security radio that a suspicious young man was loitering in the restricted motorcade zone. He reported it. The report was received, but nothing was done. Yigal Amir remained in the restricted zone, unchallenged, for the duration of the rally. Whether that failure was the result of bureaucratic breakdown, communication collapse, or something else is a question that the commission attributed to negligence. It's probably the correct attribution, but it's also the kind of answer that tends to feel insufficient when the person who died as a result of the negligence was the prime minister of a country with one of the most sophisticated internal security services in the world. The Shin Bet's failure to protect Rabin didn't occur in isolation. It occurred against a backdrop of years of escalating incitement, documented, public, impossible to miss, that the agency had monitored closely and, in certain specific ways, had actively participated in shaping. Not in directing Amir, not in planning the assassination. The record doesn't support those claims, and I'm not making those claims. But what the record supports is more specific, and maybe in some ways more disturbing, that a paid Shin Bet agent had spent 8 years embedded in the far-right nationalist movement, that this agent had organized rallies at which Rabin was depicted as a Nazi and a traitor, that this agent knew Yigal Amir, that this agent had heard Amir discuss killing the prime minister, and that this agent either didn't report what he heard to his handlers or reported it and his handlers didn't act. Avishai Raviv, codenamed Champagne. He was tried in 2000 for failing to prevent the assassination, and he was acquitted. The court ruled that no evidence had been presented that he knew that Amir actually intended to act. The court also noted with some candor that Raviv had spent 8 years as a professional liar, lying to his family, his associates, and at times to his own handlers, and that assessing the reliability and completeness of anything he reported during those years was genuinely difficult. The sections of the Shamgar Commission report dealing specifically with Raviv, with what he reported and when and what his handlers did with that information, were all classified. And they've never been made public. 30 years on, they remain sealed. What does the full Raviv file contain? Nobody outside a very small circle of Israeli officials actually knows. What questions would it answer? And what questions would it raise? We don't know. Is its continued classification a routine matter of protecting intelligence methods and sources? Or does it reflect a more specific reluctance to account fully for what the Shin Bet knew and when it knew it? That question has been asked by Israeli journalists, by members of the Knesset, and by people far less disposed towards conspiracy thinking than those labels might suggest. It hasn't been answered. Yigal Amir killed Yitzhak Rabin. That's not in dispute, and it's not the subject of this episode. The subject of this episode is the world that produced the killing, the incitement, the failures, the specific documented gaps in the official record, and the government files that remain closed. Because political violence doesn't just sprout up out of nowhere. It's cultivated. It's incubated in rhetoric and in theology and the particular cruelty of leaders who allow hatred to be performed in their presence without objection, and in systems that watch dangerous men closely without ever quite watching them closely enough. Rabin understood that. He had spent his life in systems exactly like that. He just never imagined he would be the one they failed to protect. Walt Whitman, one of my favorites, in the long summer of mourning that followed the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, wrote a poem he called "This Dust Was Once the Man." You may remember it from the final episode of the original Ides of April series. It's 4 lines. It does not explain anything or argue anything. It simply holds the weight of what was lost. A man, plain and resolute, under whose hand a nation was saved. Whitman understood that some deaths do not resolve into meaning, no matter how long you look at them. They simply leave a shape in the world where something necessary used to be. Rabin's assassination didn't end the peace process immediately, but it ruptured it. The momentum that Oslo had generated, fragile, contested, imperfect as it was, required exactly the kind of stubborn, unsentimental political will that Rabin embodied, and that very few people in Israeli politics were prepared to sustain in his absence. The negotiations continued fitfully for years, but they've not produced a resolution. The questions Oslo was meant to answer are still open. The walls that have gone up in the decades since the handshake on the South Lawn are, in some cases, literal. The folded page of Shir LaShalom is preserved today at the Rabin Center in Tel Aviv. The last verse of that song, the verse Rabin was singing when he folded it and put it in his pocket, translates roughly as this: "Don't say the day will come. Bring that day." It's not a dream. It wasn't a dream. It was a possibility. And in a parking lot in Tel Aviv on the 4th of November, 1995, that possibility ended. Thanks for listening to the Ides of April. This has been The Last Handshake, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. The Ides of April is an EVO production recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For the Ides of April, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.